Part 1. They say grief makes everything louder. The refrigerator hum, the floorboards settling, the tick of a wall clock you never noticed when the person you loved was still alive. The morning after we buried my father, I stood alone in his study with a cardboard banker's box balanced on my knee, sunlight cutting through dusty blinds, the room smelling like old paper, coffee grounds, and the cedar soap he used his entire life. My father was a man of routine, a quiet man, a man of faith. But inside that box, I found a hole in his life. For 40 years, he sent $500 every month to a nameless account. No letters, no phone calls, just money. And when I saw it, a cold thought slid into my mind so fast it made me sick. I thought I had found his dark secret. I thought my mother had been betrayed. I was wrong. But I didn't know that yet, and what I found next would change the way I remembered my father forever. Remember this, every month, no matter what, the money left. That was the first thing that got under my skin. Not one missed payment, not one. My father, Daniel Mercer, had worked 38 years at the county water department. He ironed his shirts on Sunday nights. He clipped coupons. He rinsed sandwich bags and hung them to dry over the sink. He drove the same beige truck until the driver's door had to be kicked shut in winter. This was not a man who bled money. This was a man who counted quarters into little paper rolls. So why was he sending $500 a month into the dark? I spread the statements across his desk. The lamp by his Bible cast a warm yellow circle over the pages. Outside, rain tapped the window in soft little fingernails. The old heater hissed and clicked. The transfers were there month after month, year after year, marching backward in time like soldiers. Same amount, same routing number, same silence. My stomach tightened. Eli, I turned. My cousin Rosie stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee, one chipped and one cracked. Rosie had been in motion since the funeral started, folding chairs, feeding relatives, finding death certificates, making sure my mother took her blood pressure pills. She was 5 feet of pure momentum, wearing a red sweater that smelled faintly of cinnamon gum and rain. Every family has one person who keeps the whole machine from falling apart. Rosie was ours. You disappeared, she said softly. I'm fine. You are absolutely not fine. She handed me the chipped mug. That's why I brought the strong stuff. I looked back at the papers. Rosie followed my eyes. What is all this? For a second I almost lied. Because saying it out loud would make it real. Saying it out loud would drag my father down from the clean pedestal grief had placed him on and pin him under suspicion. But grief also makes you cruel. He was sending money, I said. Every month for decades, Rosie frowned. To who? That's the problem, I don't know. The room got very quiet, rain, heater, clock, breath. Rosie set her mug down carefully. Do you think? I don't know what I think. But I did know, or thought I did, and the thought made my face burn. A second life. A hidden woman. Maybe children somewhere. Maybe a little house on the other side of the state where another version of my father had existed while my mother packed his lunches and waited at church alone on Wednesday nights. It felt ugly. It felt possible, and that was the worst part. Remember this, every month, no matter what the money left. I dug deeper into the box. Tax returns, insurance forms, manuals for appliances we no longer owned. Then, buried between 2 bank envelopes, I found a canceled check so old the paper had gone soft at the folds. 1983, same amount, same destination. My father's signature looked younger there, firmer, almost hopeful. Rosie leaned closer. Maybe it's charity. He already tithed through church. Maybe he sponsored someone. For 40 years, without telling Mom, Rosie said nothing. That silence fed the worst part of me. The suspicious part. The injured son who had spent his whole life believing his father was carved from oak and scripture and honesty. And then another voice arrived. Slick, poisonous. The kind of voice that doesn't shout because it doesn't have to, it just whispers. You didn't really know him. People like your father hide best because nobody ever thinks to look. That voice had a pull to it, a temptation, a dirty thrill, because if my father was flawed, deeply flawed, then all the distance between us, all the awkward silences, all the words we never said, none of that would be my fault. It would be his. I hated that voice. I listened anyway. I took the statements to the dining room table, where the late afternoon light went gray and thin. My mother was asleep upstairs, exhausted, finally sedated by sorrow and casseroles and sympathy. The house smelled like lilies from the funeral and onion soup from a crock-pot someone had dropped off. Rosie sat across from me with a yellow legal pad reading dates aloud while I made a timeline. "Here," she said suddenly, "this account number changes in 76. I looked up. "What?" She slid the paper toward me. "See. Same amount. Different routing path, like the destination changed banks." My pulse picked up. That meant movement, a trail, something human. I went back to the box and checked every sleeve, every folder, every forgotten corner. My fingers came away dusty. Then I found it, a small white envelope with no stamp, tucked inside my father's old confirmation Bible. Inside was a single note, one sentence typed on yellowing paper, "For the debt I can never repay." That was it. No name, no explanation. No date beyond 1975 penciled in the corner. A strange chill moved through me. Not relief. Not yet, because that sentence could mean anything. Guilt, sin, blackmail, hush money dressed up in noble language. I stared at it until the letters blurred. Rosie whispered, "That doesn't sound like an affair." "No," I said, "it sounds worse." She looked up sharply. "Eli." But I was already reaching for my phone. If there was an account, there was a history. If there was a history, there might be an address. And if there was an address, maybe there was a woman who knew my father better than I did. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked where my mother turned in her sleep. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. I looked again at my father's note. "For the debt I can never repay." And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something cut through the numbness. Not sadness, not even anger. Obsession, because somewhere behind that sentence was the truth, and I had already crossed the line where not knowing hurt more than finding out. Remember this, every month, no matter what, the money left. The next morning, I would start tracing where it went. And by the time I found the address, I would realize I had been accusing the wrong man. Part 2 the next morning came in gray, not bright gray, not hopeful gray, the kind that pressed against the windows like wet wool. I was already awake before the coffee maker sputtered on, sitting at my father's dining room table with a spiral notebook, 3 bank statements, and that single typed sentence laid in front of me like evidence in a trial. "For the debt I can never repay." The house was too still. My mother was still asleep upstairs. The funeral flowers had started to sour, just a little, mixing their sweet perfume with the stale smell of yesterday's coffee and damp coats hanging by the door. Somewhere in the walls, pipes knocked softly. The old clock in the hallway ticked on like it had no idea a life had ended here 3 days ago. I stared at the account numbers and dates until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a code. 40 years of obedience, 40 years of secrecy, 40 years of my father waking up, going to work, saying grace, taking my mother to church, standing beside me at graduations and birthdays. And somewhere in all of that, every month, no matter what, the money left. Rosie came in wearing mismatched socks and one of my father's old flannel shirts tied over her t-shirt like she owned the place. She carried a legal pad, a pen, and a toaster waffle hanging from her mouth. "You look worse," she said around a bite. "Thanks. You're welcome." She sat across from me, pulled the waffle out and pointed with it. "So, we doing this?" I nodded. And just like that, the investigation began. Rosie made columns. Dates, banks, routing numbers I called branches. Most gave me nothing. Privacy policy. Sorry for your loss. We can't disclose recipient information. A few were kind enough to suggest probate channels. One transferred me 4 times before disconnecting. By 10 in the morning, my coffee was cold, my jaw hurt from clenching it, and the note from 1975 felt heavier every time I looked at it. The temptation voice came back. He hid it because it was shameful. You know that, don't you? Good men don't bury secrets in Bibles. I shoved that thought down and dialed another number. At 10:37, something changed. A woman in records at a regional bank in Dayton listened to my explanation longer than the others had. I heard keyboards clicking, papers shifting. Her voice lowered. I can't give you account ownership, she said. But if you are executor, I can confirm historical payment instruments attached to your father's outgoing transfers. I sat up. Yes, I'm executor. Read me the transfer memo. I read the note. My throat went dry halfway through. For the debt I can never repay. Silence. More keys, then. That phrase appears on older paper payments, yes. Prior to digitization. My pulse jumped. Can you tell me where they were mailed? Another pause. Sir, I'm only permitted to confirm whether an address you provide matches archived remittance data. Rosie mouthed, we need an address first. Right. A trail, not a miracle. So we built the trail ourselves. The first routing number led to a now-merged credit union. The credit union records pointed to a rural disbursement office in western Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania office had been absorbed by another bank in the early 90s. Rosie found that through an old newspaper archive faster than I could. She was chewing cinnamon gum so hard I could hear it snap. Your father really knew how to vanish inside paperwork, she muttered. By noon, the rain had stopped, but the sky stayed low and colorless. The kitchen smelled like burned toast and copier dust from the old file box we dragged out of the hall closet. Upstairs, I could hear my mother moving around now, drawer opening, closing, slow footsteps. That sound hit me harder than anything. She was getting dressed into widowhood while I sat downstairs trying to prove whether her marriage had been real. And for one ugly moment I considered stopping. Just bury it again. Burn the note. Close the box. Let my father remain what he had always seemed to be. Let my mother keep her peace. But then Rosie found something. Eli. Her voice had changed. I looked up. She was holding a tax return from 1989, not the return itself. The carbon copy sheet beneath it, where hard pen pressure had left faint impressions from something once written on top. She angled it under the lamp, there, barely visible, a name fragment or part of one. Len. Alan, I said, maybe. Ellen, maybe that too, she looked at me, but it's something. That little half-word landed in the room like a match, not enough to warm anything, just enough to start a fire. I grabbed my father's old desk pencil and shaded the page gently, old detective movie style, until more marks surfaced. A sequence of numbers, then a partial street abbreviation. Route 6. Rosie's eyes widened. That's not a person, that's an address trail. For the next hour, we chased that scrap through county property maps, old phone directories, and archived postal district charts. My father had kept records the way he did everything else, carefully, but only as much as necessary. No letters, no receipts beyond the canceled checks, nothing sentimental, just enough breadcrumbs to prove intention, not meaning. At 1:14 p.m., my mother appeared in the doorway. She looked smaller somehow. Grief had a way of shrinking people. Her cardigan hung loose. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if crying had exhausted itself and left only weight behind. She smelled like lavender powder, and the cold cream she used every night. "What are you two doing?" The question was gentle. That made it worse. Rosie looked at me. I opened my mouth, closed it. My mother's gaze dropped to the bank statements, then to the note. Her brow pinched. "What is that?" I stood too fast, chair scraping the floor. "Nothing, just probate stuff." She kept looking. "Your father hated probate stuff." That nearly broke me. Because it was such a small, true thing to say, such an ordinary thing, exactly the kind of detail a wife knows after 46 years of marriage. My mother stepped closer. "Eli." I couldn't tell her. Not then. Not with half a clue and all my worst suspicions still alive. So I lied. Just some old transfers I need to understand for the estate. She nodded slowly. Your father gave quietly, if that helps. I froze. What do you mean? He never liked people knowing. She gave a tired half-smile. At church, at Christmas, sometimes he'd leave groceries on porches and act like it was nothing. Then her smile faded, but I didn't know he had anything like this. That last line hung there. Rosie looked down, so my mother hadn't known. The relief I should have felt didn't come, because all it meant was that the secret had survived every anniversary, every bedtime, every year. After she left, I sat back down harder than I meant to. Rosie studied me. Still think affair. I rubbed both hands over my face. I don't know what to think anymore. And that was true. The villain voice in my head was losing ground, but it wasn't gone. It had just changed shape. Maybe this wasn't lust. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was blood. Maybe it was a crime. Maybe my father had spent 4 decades paying for something terrible done in 1975. By mid-afternoon, the clouds thinned enough for weak sunlight to stripe the table. Dust floated in it like ash. My phone battery was dying. Rosie had switched from coffee to cola. My mother was on the phone upstairs with a relative, her voice low and steady in that brave way people use when they don't want sympathy to tip them over. Then, at 3:02 p.m., the branch manager in Pennsylvania called back. I can confirm one historical mailing destination, he said. My breath stopped. He read the address once. I made him repeat it twice. Not a city apartment, not a suburban condo, not some hidden life tucked just beyond our own. It was a tiny house on a rural road in a town my father had never mentioned. A town, as far as I knew, he had never visited. Rosie whispered, "Who lives there?" I don't know. But already the mystery had changed shape again. Because if there had been another woman, wouldn't he have gone there, called there, left any sign beyond money? This was different, stranger, colder, sadder. I wrote the address in my notebook and stared at it until the ink seemed to darken. A tiny, rundown house, a town my father never visited, a payment that never failed. And somewhere at that address, if the records were right, was the person who had been receiving my father's secret for 40 years. I didn't know yet that, when I got there, the woman who opened the door would have no idea who Daniel Mercer was. I only knew I was going. The next morning, early, because every month no matter what the money left. And now I finally knew where it had been going. Part 3 I left before sunrise, not because the drive was long. Because I couldn't sleep. All night the address sat on my bedside table like a dare. A farmhouse number on a rural route in a town so small I had to zoom in twice to find it on the map. I kept picturing what waited there. A polished lie. A woman with my father's eyes reflected in hers. A son older than me. A daughter who shared my chin. Then I'd picture something else. A blackmail scheme. A debt collector. A secret shame preserved in silence and money. Every version ended with my father becoming someone I did not know. By 5:12 a.m., I gave up on sleep, showered in the dark and dressed in yesterday's jeans. The mirror over the sink made me look older than I felt and younger than I wanted. My face was drawn. My eyes were wired and bruised with grief. Downstairs, the kitchen was blue with pre-dawn light, the counters cold to the touch, the air smelling like stale coffee grounds, dish soap, and the last faint sweetness of funeral lilies that should have been thrown out already. Rosie was already there. She stood by the toaster in a denim jacket, hair tied up, holding 2 travel mugs. Like this had always been the plan. I blinked. "How are you always awake before me?" She handed me a mug. "Trauma. Also caffeine. I'm serious. So am I." She took a sip. "You didn't think I was letting you do this alone, right?" I should have argued. I should have told her to stay with my mother, to keep the house steady, to keep one person anchored in normal life while I drove into whatever waited at the end of that address. But the truth was, I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts for 2 hours. Rosie knew that before I did, so 20 minutes later we were on the road. The highway stretched ahead in gray ribbons, wet from the previous day's rain. The sky was pale and low. Bare trees lined the roadside, black branches clawing at the dawn. Our tires hummed over the asphalt. Every now and then, a semi roared past, shaking the little rental car and leaving behind the smell of diesel and cold air. Rosie kept the radio low, old soul music, soft enough not to intrude, just enough to stop the silence from becoming a third passenger. For the first 40 minutes, we barely spoke. My mind kept circling the same sentence. For the debt I can never repay. Debt, not love, not regret, not memory, debt. That word mattered. It implied obligation, something owed, something counted, something measured month by month, year by year, until a human life had been quietly built around making sure the payment never stopped. Every month, no matter what, the money left. Rosie finally broke the silence. Let's say it's not an affair. I kept my eyes on the road. Okay. Then what? I don't know. No, seriously, best case. I thought about it. Morning light was beginning to rise over the fields now, turning puddles in the ditches into streaks of white fire. A flock of birds lifted suddenly from a power line, black against the silver sky. Best case, I said, he was helping someone. And worst case, I tightened my grip on the wheel. He was paying for something. Rosie nodded slowly, like she'd been carrying the same thought but didn't want to hand it to me first. We passed through 3 small towns that looked half asleep, closed diners, gas stations with flickering signs, a barber pole turning in an empty shop window. By the time the sun climbed high enough to show color, we were off the highway and on a narrower road that cut through open country. Old barns leaned in fields gone winter brown. Telephone poles marched toward the horizon. The road narrowed again, then again. The map said we had 20 more minutes. My stomach started to turn. Rosie noticed. Want me to drive? No, you look like you're going to throw up. I might. That's fair. She unwrapped a peppermint and handed it over without looking at me. That was Rosie's way. No speech. No false comfort, just something practical when the world got too big. I took it. The town, if you could call it that, appeared almost by accident. A church with peeling white paint, a one-pump gas station, a shuttered feed store, a post office the size of a garage. The kind of place where news probably moved faster than weather. We rolled through at 30 miles an hour, the tires crunching grit, and for a strange second I had the feeling that my father had been here. Not in body maybe, but in consequence. For 40 years a part of his paycheck had landed in this place. Quietly, faithfully, like a second heartbeat no one in our family ever heard. The address led us another mile out, down a road with no center line. And then I saw the house. It was smaller than I expected. Not picturesque, not storybook, just tired. A single-story place with sagging porch steps, chipped blue paint, and a roof patched in mismatched shingles. One shutter hung crooked. A rusted swing frame stood in the yard with no swing on it, just 2 empty hooks moving slightly in the breeze. The grass was thin. The mailbox leaned. On the porch sat 3 flower pots filled not with flowers but with dry dirt and last year's stems. The whole place looked like it had survived on just enough for a very long time. I parked by the ditch and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence after the car died was huge. Wind in the weeds. A dog barking somewhere far off. The metallic ticking of the cooling engine. And under it all, that nervous, electric rush in my chest that felt almost like fear and almost like anger, and exactly like the moment before a truth arrives. Rosie looked at me. Still want me here? I nodded. We got out. The cold hit first sharp, clean, carrying the smell of wet earth, wood smoke, and something faintly medicinal from a nearby burn barrel. Gravel crunched under our shoes as we walked up the path. Each step felt too loud, too deliberate. I noticed everything because I could not notice. The screen door patched with wire, the faded welcome mat, the small ceramic angel by the steps with one broken wing. I raised my hand to knock, then stopped, because suddenly it hit me. Whatever waited on the other side of that door would become permanent the second it spoke. Up until now, My father's secret had still been made of paper and suspicion and maybe. Once someone answered, the maybe would die. Rosie leaned in and murmured, "Eli." I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Inside I heard movement, slow, careful. A chair leg dragging, footsteps. Then the screen door creaked and the front door opened inward 3 inches. An elderly woman looked out at us. She was small and fine-boned, with silver hair pinned back loosely, and a face marked not by softness but by endurance. She wore a cardigan buttoned wrong and held the door with one hand as if balance had become something to negotiate with. Behind her the house was dim. I caught a smell of old wood, mothballs, canned soup, and something sweet, maybe apples simmered too long. "Yes," her voice was cautious but not afraid. I took a breath. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. My name is Eli Mercer. I'm trying to learn about a series of monthly payments sent to this address." She blinked, looked from me to Rosie and back again. "I think there must be some mistake," she said. "Does someone named Allen live here?" I asked. Her expression changed, just slightly, a flicker, recognition, then pain. "My husband was Walter Allen," she said quietly. "He passed a long time ago. Not Ellen Allen." Rosie's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. Another breadcrumb clicking into place. I swallowed. "Were you receiving funds from an account from someone named Daniel Mercer?" The woman frowned. Not offended, not guarded, confused. "Daniel Mercer," she repeated. I nodded. She shook her head slowly. "I don't know anyone by that name." For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. That all the miles, all the bank records, all the old checks and routing numbers had somehow brought me to the wrong door. But the house number matched. The route matched. The payment records matched. This was it. And she had no idea who my father was. The cold breeze moved across the porch, carrying a brittle rattle through the dead stems in the flower pots. Somewhere inside the house, a TV played low, some daytime game show, all canned applause and bright fake laughter. It made the silence on the porch feel even stranger. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "You've been receiving money for years." "Monthly," her hand tightened on the door. "From where? You didn't know?" "No." Her voice had gone thin. "I only knew it came through the bank. I thought it was arranged." "By who?" She looked genuinely shaken now. "By God, maybe." Rosie let out a soft breath beside me. The woman opened the door a little wider and peered at me as if trying to solve my face. "Who did you say your father was?" "Daniel Mercer." Again, she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I don't know that name." That was the moment the entire story tipped, because I had come here prepared to confront someone who knew too much, a hidden witness, a keeper of my father's second life. Instead, standing in that cold little porch light, looking at this elderly widow in her misbuttoned sweater, I realized I had arrived at the house of a miracle. Not a scandal, not an affair. A miracle so consistent it had turned ordinary. Every month, no matter what, the money left. And every month, apparently, it arrived here like manna, unexplained, unnamed, just enough. The woman looked suddenly unsteady. Rosie stepped forward instantly. "Ma'am, can we help you sit?" That broke the tension enough for the woman to nod. "Please." We followed her inside. The living room was small and dim, lit mostly by the watery daylight slipping through lace curtains. The air was warm but dry, carrying the smells of dust, menthol rub, old upholstery, and overripe bananas in a bowl on the side table. A gas heater clicked softly in the corner. Family photos covered one wall, most of them faded. In several, I noticed the same broad-shouldered man in work clothes, smiling beside the woman now lowering herself into a recliner. Walter Allen, I assumed. Rosie moved automatically, straightening a cushion, checking if the woman needed water, switching off the blaring television. Caregiving looked natural on her, like some people are born with a reflex to steady whatever is shaking. I envied that. I was still standing there, holding my notebook like a weapon that no longer fit the fight. The woman looked up at me. "How long?" she asked. I glanced down at my notes. My mouth had gone dry. 40 years. Her eyes widened. And before I could say another word, before I could ask the question that was already burning through me. Who was Walter Allen, and what happened in 1975? Rosie reached for a framed photograph on the side table, turned it toward the light, and said 3 words that made the room go completely still. I think this is him. That was when I saw the date on the back. And the year matched the note. 1975. Part 4. Rosie held the photograph at an angle toward the window, where the weak afternoon light could catch it. Dust drifted in the beam like pale smoke. The frame was cheap wood, nicked at the corners, the glass slightly fogged from age. Inside was a man in work coveralls standing beside an older model pickup, one hand on the hood, one hand lifted as if he'd been caught halfway through a laugh. Thick shoulders, broad face, dark hair, ordinary features except for one thing: his eyes. There was something in them I recognized immediately. Not the shape, not the color, the expression. That calm, steady way of looking at the camera as if the person behind it mattered, as if whoever needed help would get it. On the back of the photo, written in blue ink gone faint, were 4 words: Walter, summer before the fire. And beneath that, 1975. The room seemed to contract around that date. The heater clicked. The lace curtains lifted and fell in a draft. Somewhere deeper in the house, an old refrigerator kicked on with a low mechanical groan. I stared at those numbers until they felt less like a date and more like the edge of a door. The widow, Mrs. Allen, I now knew, followed my eyes to the back of the frame and pressed one hand slowly against her chest. The fire, she repeated. I haven't heard anyone say it like that in years. Rosie set the photo carefully on the coffee table. Ma'am, what fire? Mrs. Allen looked from Rosie to me. Her face had changed. The confusion was still there, but behind it something older was waking up. Something buried. Memory has a smell to it sometimes. In that room it felt like old wool, dust, and heat trapped in wood. Like time warming back up. She wet her lips. The mill fire. The words landed heavy. I sat forward. What mill? The textile mill out on Route 9. It's gone now. She pointed vaguely through the wall toward fields and trees and distance. Used to employ half the county. Her voice went quieter. My Walter worked maintenance. A chill moved up my back, because suddenly the note for the debt I can never repay had weighed in a different direction now. Not romance, not betrayal, fire. Rosie glanced at me. She was thinking the same thing. Did Daniel Mercer ever work there? Mrs. Allen frowned. I don't know that name, she said again. But there were so many boys hired on seasonal in those years, young men passing through, men trying to learn a trade, men who didn't stay, young men. My father had been 22 in 1975. My heartbeat thudded once, hard enough to feel in my throat. Can you tell us what happened? I asked. Mrs. Allen's gaze settled on the photograph. She didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind scraped bare branches against one another with a dry, whispering sound. The room had gone dimmer as clouds thickened, and the smell of the gas heater sharpened in the stillness. Rosie reached over and switched on a lamp with a yellow shade, filling the corners with warm, tired light. Mrs. Allen folded her hands in her lap. It was August, she said at last. Hotter than sin that year. The kind of heat that made the air smell like metal and grease before noon. Her voice grew steadier as the memories formed. The mill had old wiring. Everyone knew it. They were supposed to fix it. They didn't. Then one afternoon something sparked near the dye room. She paused. I could hear it in my head already. Not the facts, the sounds. The dyes burned fast, she said. Chemicals, cloth, oil. Once it started, it ran. Her fingers tightened together. There were men inside. The room went very still. Every month, no matter what, the money left. And now, for the first time, I could feel why. Mrs. Allen continued, her eyes no longer really seeing us. Walter was outside when the alarm hit. Most of the men came running. Some didn't. She swallowed. There was one still in there. A young fellow trapped by the back stairwell. I leaned closer. Do you know his name? She shook her head slowly. Walter never told me, or maybe he did and I let it go. I was young. We had 2 babies then. Everything felt like survival. Her voice trembled. He only said the boy was scared, barely more than a child. Something inside me shifted when she said that. My father had always seemed old to me, even in photos of his youth. He had that kind of face. Serious. Reserved, built for responsibility. But 22 is not old. 22 is still a boy when death comes close. What did Walter do? Rosie asked softly. Mrs. Allen stared at the photograph so long I thought she might not answer. Then she said, what he always did. He went back in. I shut my eyes, and suddenly I could see it though I had never been there. A mill yard in brutal August heat, sirens thin and far away, men shouting over the roar, smoke black and thick punching into the sky, the air tasting like pennies and ash, fabric burning with that strange bitter smell that catches in the throat. A young man trapped somewhere inside, my father maybe coughing, blinded, panicking, and Walter Allen turning around when everyone else was trying to get clear. Rosie whispered, "Oh God." Mrs. Allen nodded once. That's what I said too, over and over. The lamp buzzed softly. The house creaked. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot lid rattled as if the whole place had exhaled. He found the boy, she said. Got him moving, got him almost all the way out. She stopped again, and in that stop was the whole sorrow of the story. Then something came down. No one spoke. A beam, I asked. She nodded. That's what they said. My chest felt tight. The temptation villain inside me, that ugly whisper that had spent 3 parts trying to turn my father into a selfish man, finally lost its footing. It didn't vanish in one dramatic moment. It just had nowhere left to stand. Instead, another feeling took its place. Worse, somehow. Not suspicion. Shame. Because while my father had spent 40 years honoring a debt no one asked him to pay, I had spent 3 days tearing his name apart in my own mind. Mrs. Allen rubbed at one knee absently, like the weather lived in her bones now. The young man lived, she said. Walter didn't. There it was. The sentence. Plain, final. My ears rang. Rosie reached for my arm, maybe because she saw my face drain, maybe because she was built to catch falling things before they hit. I barely felt her hand. The room around me, the smell of menthol and dust, the faded wallpaper, the ticking little clock on the shelf, suddenly felt unbearably intimate. I was sitting inside the consequence of one split-second act from 1975. The widow's threadbare curtains, the patched roof, the too small heater, the empty swing hooks outside, all of it traced back to that moment in the mill, and to my father's survival. I looked at the photo again. Did Walter have life insurance? Mrs. Allen let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it didn't hurt so much. Not enough, hardly anything. She looked around the room as if it answered for her. The union helped a little, church helped a little, then people moved on. That's what happens. Tragedy gets casseroles for a week and silence after. Rosie lowered her eyes at that. I said, so the money, Mrs. Allen blinked at me, started months later. How much did you receive? She thought. At first it was less. Then, sometime in the early 80s, it became 500. My father's promotion at the water department had happened in 1982. He'd picked up night shifts after that. My mother used to complain, gently, lovingly, that he worked too much and never explained why he needed the overtime. I'd thought he was just built that way, built for labor, built for discipline. No, he had been building this. Every month, no matter what, the money left. Mrs. Allen looked past me, toward the window, seeing some long-ago season instead of the gray day outside. I thought maybe it was from the company. Then I learned it wasn't. Then I thought maybe someone from Walter's family had arranged it. Then they all passed, one by one. She gave the smallest shrug. After enough years, I stopped asking. Some things are too sacred to poke at. Sacred. That word hurt more than the others, because my father had never told us not to be praised, not to be forgiven, not even to be understood. He had carried it alone. 40 years of extra shifts. 40 years of watching a bank line item go through and saying nothing at the dinner table. 40 years of living with the knowledge that another man had died in the space where he should have. Survivor's guilt. That was the shape of it now, clear as a bell. Rosie broke the silence first. Did he ever visit? Mrs. Allen looked puzzled. No. Did he ever write? No. Call? She shook her head. Of course he didn't. Because this had never been about contact. Contact might have made it about him, might have invited gratitude, might have opened a place where forgiveness could enter, but he hadn't wanted forgiveness. He'd wanted obligation, the debt I can never repay. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. A kettle on the stove in the kitchen gave one small sigh of steam, and Rosie rose automatically to check it, disappearing around the corner. I heard cupboard doors open, the clink of mugs, the faucet running. Caregiving in motion again. The side character who never stayed still long enough to let pain harden in one place. Mrs. Allen studied me more closely now. You didn't know, did you? I shook my head. No. A long silence passed between us. Not awkward, just true. Then she asked, was your father a quiet man? I almost laughed at the precision of it. Yes, she nodded. Walter was too. Her mouth softened. Quiet men do strange, holy things sometimes, and then they die with them still inside. That sentence hit somewhere deep and unfinished in me, because my father and I had loved each other, yes, but we had not been easy with each other. We had never been the kind of men who spilled emotion into the room. We talked through tasks, through weather, through car repairs and church services and whether the tomatoes would make it through late frost. There had always been affection, but rarely language. And now the biggest truth about him had arrived after his funeral. Rosie came back balancing 3 mugs of tea that smelled like chamomile and something medicinal. She set one in front of Mrs. Allen, one in front of me, and kept one for herself, though she barely drank it. I wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat seep into my fingers. When was the last payment? Mrs. Allen asked quietly. I looked up. Her eyes had sharpened, not with greed, with fear. And there it was the next turn because she knew. Maybe not about my father, but about math, about age, about time. A miracle that comes every month for 40 years teaches you what happens when miracles stop. My voice came out rough. Last month, she inhaled, shallow and quick. The room changed again, not into grief, into math. Into mortgage due dates and utility bills and medication costs, and roof patches and property taxes. Into all the practical terrors that arrive while emotion is still trying to stand up. Rosie understood first. Of course she did. She said gently, this house is the payment tied to keeping it. Mrs. Allen looked down at her tea. Yes, just one word, but it carried the whole weight of the next act. The mortgage was refinanced years ago after the furnace failed. Then taxes went up. Then my son got sick before he passed. Then the repairs. She looked around, embarrassed by her own home, which somehow made me ache even more. 500 is what kept me level. Not safe, just level. The exact amount she needed. I felt a jolt go through me so hard it was almost physical. My father hadn't been guessing. He had known. He had followed the need closely enough to adjust and maintain it without ever stepping into the picture. Not charity from a distance. Care. Precise care. Every month, no matter what, the money left. Outside, wind pressed a bare branch against the window, making a scratching sound like a pen trying to write. The day was fading toward evening, and the house grew amber under the lamp, more fragile somehow in that light. I looked at the photograph of Walter. Then at Mrs. Allen, then at my own hands around the tea mug, hands shaped more like my father's than I had ever liked to admit. This was no longer about a secret. It was about an inheritance. Not money, not property. A moral debt passing from one life into another. I swallowed hard. Mrs. Allen, she looked up. There's something I need to explain. And when I said that, I realized 2 things at once. First, this was the moment my father had never allowed himself to have. Second, once I told her, her miracle would get a name. And names change things. Sometimes they heal, sometimes they break. I didn't know yet which this would do. Part 5. Mrs. Allen looked at me across the small living room, her tea cooling untouched in both hands. The lamp beside her threw a circle of honey-colored light over the Afghan on her knees, over the old photographs, over the worn arms of the recliner where time had polished the fabric smooth. Outside, evening had begun to settle into the windows, blue and cold, while inside the house held the smells of chamomile, dust, gas heat, and the faint sweetness of stewed apples from somewhere deeper in the kitchen. It was the kind of room where life had not been easy, but it had been endured, and now it was waiting on me. "There's something I need to explain," I said again. Mrs. Allen's eyes lifted to mine. They were tired eyes, careful eyes, eyes that had learned not to expect too much from the world, because expecting less hurt less. Rosie sat beside me on the edge of the sofa, still and quiet for once, her hands folded around her mug. She understood before I did that this was not a moment to rush. Some truths arrive like a storm. Others need to be placed gently, like setting down glass. I took a breath. My father was the young man in the mill. The room did not explode. It did something worse. It went silent. Mrs. Allen stared at me, not blinking, not moving, as if the sentence had reached her body but not yet her mind. The heater clicked on. A car passed somewhere on the road outside, tires whispering over gravel. The little shelf clock ticked with cruel steadiness. I kept going because if I stopped, I might never finish. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 22 in 1975. He never told us what happened, not fully. We only found the payments after he passed. My voice roughened on the next part. I think Walter Allen saved his life, and I think my father spent the next 40 years trying to honor that. Mrs. Allen inhaled sharply. Her hand flew to her mouth. The mug in her other hand trembled, rattling softly against the saucer Rosie had placed nearby. For one fragile second I thought she might drop it. Rosie moved without sound, kneeling beside her, taking the mug before it spilled. Caregiving again, always just in time. Mrs. Allen's eyes filled. "No," she whispered, not refusing, not denying. Just overwhelmed by the size of it, I leaned forward. "I know this is a shock." She shook her head, tears already beginning to gather. "No, I mean no." Her voice broke. "He lived." That question cut through me, because hidden inside it was 40 years of not knowing. 40 years of never learning whether Walter's last act had changed anything, whether it had mattered beyond a line in a local article and a folded flag, and the slow, hard economics of widowhood. She had not just been receiving money from a stranger, she had been living beside an unanswered question. "Yes," I said, "he lived." A tear slid down her cheek, then another, and suddenly she began to cry the way some people do after holding a wall up too long, quietly at first, then with the unstoppable force of something ancient finally giving way. Rosie reached for a box of tissues before I even saw it on the end table. Mrs. Allen took one, pressed it to her mouth, and closed her eyes. "He lived," she said again, as if testing whether the word stayed true each time. "Walter got him out and he lived." I felt my own throat tighten. Yes, for a while no one said anything. The house made its own sounds around us. The kettle cooling in the kitchen, the dry whisper of branches at the window, the TV, still muted now, flickering blue light across the wallpaper. In another life, in another mood, it would have felt ordinary. But at that moment, every little household noise seemed to witness what was happening in that room. Every month, no matter what, the money left. And now, finally, the reason had arrived with it. Mrs. Allen dabbed at her eyes. "He never wrote. No, never came. No," she nodded faintly, almost to herself. "That sounds right." I blinked. "It does." A sad little smile touched her mouth. "A man carrying that much grief doesn't come for tea." She looked toward Walter's photograph. "He pays, he works, he prays maybe, but he doesn't come." That was my father, more perfectly than I ever could have said it. The words undid something in me, because I had spent so much of my life wishing he were easier to know, easier to read, easier to reach. I used to think love that was not spoken plainly had failed somehow. That if a father did not explain himself, did not open his chest and lay out every wound, then he was withholding something essential. But sitting there, in the home of the woman he had quietly protected for 4 decades, I understood a harder truth. Some people speak in sacrifice because they were never taught another language. Mrs. Allen looked at me again, more steadily now. Did he have a good life? The question surprised me. I should have expected it. Of course she would ask. Of course the widow of a man who died saving a stranger would want to know what became of that stranger. Whether the life purchased with Walter's death had been squandered or cherished, I swallowed. Yes, I said. A quiet one, a faithful one. He married my mother, worked hard, raised me, showed up, fixed things, helped people when nobody was looking. I glanced down and the next words nearly took me apart. I think he tried very hard to be worth what Walter gave him. Mrs. Allen closed her eyes at that. Then she nodded. Rosie looked away, blinking fast. She had held herself together all day through logistics and tea and rescue and practical questions. But that line found her. Maybe because Rosie had spent her whole life measuring love by action too. Mrs. Allen reached for the photograph and held it in both hands. Her thumb moved over the edge of the frame like she was touching Walter through time. He would have liked that, she murmured. To know it was a good man. Good man. I almost told her my father would hate being called that. He would shrug it off, change the subject, ask if the gutter by the porch had been looked at lately. But maybe that was exactly why the title belonged to him. The room grew darker. Rosie got up and switched on another lamp near the bookshelf. Warm light filled the corners, softening the room, finding the faded family portraits along the wall. I stood and moved closer to them, looking now with different eyes. Walter in coveralls. Walter holding a little boy on his shoulders. Walter and Mrs. Allen in front of a Christmas tree with too much tinsel. A grainy wedding picture. Evidence of a life cut short but not erased. And then I saw what I hadn't really noticed before. The house wasn't just old. It was fragile. Water damage in one ceiling corner. A crack running above the window frame. Medication bottles lined in careful order on a tray. A stack of unopened utility envelopes tucked beneath a ceramic bird. The $500 had not been luxury. It had been ballast. Mrs. Allen followed my gaze. It kept me here, she said quietly. The money. I turned back. She set the photograph down and folded her hands, almost embarrassed now that the practical thing had entered the room after the holy one. I'm ashamed to even say it after what you've told me, but that payment. She looked around the room. It's the difference between this house staying mine and not. Rosie sat back down slowly. You said it was the exact amount you needed. Mrs. Allen nodded. Month after month. Her mouth trembled. I used to call it my miracle envelope even after it went electronic. Silly, I know. No, Rosie said. Not silly. Mrs. Allen looked at me, and now the fear beneath the gratitude was visible. If your father is gone, there it was, the real stake, the sensitive one, not memory, survival. A miracle with a human source can stop the moment the human does. I had known this conversation was coming from the second she asked, when the last payment was sent. But knowing a thing and speaking it are miles apart. I looked down at my father's handwriting in my notebook, copied from the old papers. Dates, transfers, 40 years of stubborn fidelity. An inheritance. I heard my father in my head, not words because he rarely gave many, but the shape of his ethic. Finish what is yours to finish. Keep your word. Don't make another person pay for your relief. My whole life, I had thought the defining secret of my father would be some hidden weakness. Instead, it was hidden honor. And honor once uncovered asks something of the people who find it. I sat down again. Mrs. Allen, I said, my father made a promise with his life, even if he never said it out loud. I don't think he believed that promise should die with him. She stared at me. Rosie turned toward me too, and I could feel the question in her, not whether it was right, whether I meant it. I did. The payment will continue, I said. Mrs. Allen made a small sound I will never forget. Not a sob, not a gasp, something deeper. The sound a person makes when pressure leaves their body too suddenly and they don't yet know how to stand without it. Her shoulders folded inward. "Oh," she whispered. Rosie covered her mouth. I kept going before my own emotions could derail me. "I'll work out the details with the bank. I'm not saying this out of pity. I'm saying it because my father spent 40 years telling us what mattered, even if he never used words. Walter Allen gave him a future. My father gave part of that future back. I'm not going to be the one who breaks that line." Mrs. Allen cried openly then. Rosie cried too, though she tried to hide it by fussing with the tea tray. The room had that strange, sacred disorder grief sometimes makes. Tissues, mugs, old photographs, weak lamplight, strangers becoming connected in ways no one would have chosen and no one could undo. I felt tears burning now myself, but what came with them was not just sadness. It was relief, because for days I had been living inside the possibility that my father's secret would diminish him, that it would stain my mother's memory of their marriage, that it would crack my own childhood in half. Instead, the truth had done the opposite. It had widened him. Mrs. Allen reached for my hand then. Her fingers were cool and thin and trembling. "Your father," she said carefully, as if naming him changed the air itself, "was my nameless blessing." I looked at her hand over mine, then at Walter's photograph, then at the window where night had fully arrived and turned the glass into a mirror. For a second I could almost see my father there, not literally, not as a ghost, just as a feeling. The smell of cedar soap, the roughness of his work jackets, the quiet scrape of his chair at breakfast, the way he'd pause before prayer as if lining his heart up with something exact. All those years I thought silence meant distance. Maybe, sometimes, it also meant discipline. Maybe he hadn't told the story because he was afraid if he ever did, people would call him noble, and noble was never the point. The point was Mrs. Allen stayed fed, stayed warm, stayed home. Every month, no matter what the money left. And that was his confession, his thank you, his prayer. We stayed another hour, long enough to hear more about Walter, how he whistled while repairing motors, how he once drove 30 miles for peaches because his youngest had a fever and wanted something sweet, how he hated neckties and loved gospel radio, and could not pass a stalled car without pulling over. The more I listened, the more I understood my father's debt had not only been about life, it had been about character. A good man had died. My father had measured his own days against that knowledge. Before we left, Rosie found a loose porch railing and made me tighten it with a screwdriver from the trunk, because she said leaving without fixing one thing in that house would haunt her. She was right. The air outside had gone sharp and cold, the yard silvered by moonlight, the smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the road. As I worked, Mrs. Allen stood in the doorway with a blanket over her shoulders, watching us with tears drying on her face and something softer taking their place. Peace, maybe, or recognition. When we finally said goodbye, she hugged me with surprising strength. "Tell your mother," she said into my shoulder, "that she was married to a good man." That line nearly dropped me where I stood, because until then some part of me had still been holding the first suspicion, the original poison, the fear that this truth would injure my mother somehow. But no, this story, painful as it was, belonged to her too, not as betrayal, as testimony. I promised I would tell her. Rosie and I drove home in near silence, not empty silence, full silence, the kind after a storm has passed and left the air scrubbed raw and clear. The road shone black beneath the headlights. Farmhouses slipped by in pockets of yellow light. The car smelled like cold air, peppermint, and old upholstery. Rosie cried once quietly, wiping her face with her sleeve, then laughed at herself for crying and cried harder. "You okay?" I asked. "No," she said. "Yes, I don't know." Then she looked at me. "Your dad was something else." I nodded. That was all I could do. When we got back to the house, my mother was awake in the living room under a quilt, waiting without pretending she hadn't been. The lamp by her chair cast a soft pool of light over her book, which lay unread in her lap. The room smelled like tea and linen, and the fading flowers we still hadn't thrown away. She looked up as we entered. Well, I sat across from her and told her everything. The note, the address, Walter Allen, the fire, the payments, the miracle, Mrs. Allen's words. I told her my worst suspicions, too, because honesty was owed now all the way through. My mother listened without interrupting, one hand pressed lightly against her throat. When I finished, she was crying silently, not devastated, not shattered, just deeply, deeply moved. After a while she said, "I knew there was a room in your father I'd never entered." She smiled through tears. "I just never thought it would be a chapel." I laughed once and cried at the same time. That night after Rosie left and the house quieted down again, I went into my father's study. The same box was still there. The same dust-striped light from the blinds, now pale under the moon. The same smell of paper and cedar, and cold coffee. But the room had changed because I had. I picked up the note one last time, for the debt I can never repay. No, he never could repay it, not fully. No one could. A life for a life doesn't balance cleanly. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe real honor does not erase the debt. Maybe it remembers it on purpose. Maybe real honor does not need a name. It only needs a heart. And maybe the truest things a person does are the ones no one sees until after they're gone. So let me ask you this. Have you ever received a nameless blessing? Something that arrived right when you needed it, with no spotlight, no signature, no claim for credit. If you have, then you know. Sometimes the holiest love in the world comes quietly. And every month, no matter what, it shows up. Humanized 202 words.